Though it's often against the very point of the medium of video games, more and more we look for realism in video games. Realism in visuals, in the way that they tell their stories, in the mechanics, in the world. And there's a very good reason for that. The greater sense of realism lends more believability to the virtual world we find ourselves in, making it more immersive and easier to invest in. Sure, realism isn't something that's required in every game. In fact, many kinds of games it actively works against them. But where it fits and is well done, it can be a powerful tool. It can be something that's found throughout the game, or something that defines singular moments in games that might not otherwise be too realistic. In this feature, we're going to take a look at 15 games that fit the bill. Games that were either almost too realistic, or had a few choice moments of realism, but made it all work surprisingly well. Do keep that last bit in mind. We're not suggesting that a game with dinosaurs in it or another where you can slow down time to gun down your enemies in a single flurry are realistic, only that they offer moments of realism. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Survival mechanics in Rust. By definition, survival games are built around some degree of realism, whether your character is much more vulnerable and there's things you need to be mindful of to make sure of, well, your survival. But Rust often takes this one step further. From diseases to weather, from health to severely limited resources, from the game itself to the hostile environment it creates for all players, who are constantly turning on one another. Rust is a game that can actively stress you out. That of course means that it isn't for everyone, but for those who get into it, there's a lot to lose yourself in. Combat in Operation Flashpoint Dragon Rising. If you get shot in the game, depending on where and how severe the wound, you may need to find cover real fast and apply field dressing to prevent yourself from bleeding to death. A shot in the leg will cause you to lose the ability to run or sprint, which makes sense. When you get shot, it's best to check the meter in the lower left corner of the screen to see how bad the injury is and how fast the blood flow is. If it's not too bad and the blood is flowing at a slow rate, you can hang into the fight for a little bit and try to take out the enemy or reduce the threat and then apply your field dressing. Although you must be careful of your surroundings and what you're using for cover. Pull-ups in Mass Effect 3. James Vega may not be anyone's favorite Mass Effect character, but doing pull-ups with him might just be one of the most pointless and, for some reason, fun moments in the original trilogy. There's no perks for beating his record of 180 pull-ups, no achievements, no stat boosts, no Paragon or Renegade boosts. It's just you alternating between the left and right trigger for 20 minutes while listening to a mindless conversation. So basically, it's exercise for your fingers. But when you have to show your crew who's boss, you pretty much have to beat that pull-up record, don't you? Managing body weight in GTA San Andreas. Realistic is about as far away a word can be from describing a GTA game, especially San Andreas. So no, I'm not suggesting San Andreas is realistic, obviously. But there are elements of the game that do invoke some sense of realism. For example, managing several of CJ's stats, among which body weight is also included, which is left entirely to the player. If you work out, you stay in shape, and if you eat excessively, you don't. That's not the sort of thing you'd expect to see in a game, especially not when San Andreas first came out. But it adds a greater level of control to the game and a greater feeling of ownership over CJ as a protagonist. Rainbow Six Siege. More specifically, we're talking about the tactical realism mode in Rainbow Six Siege. By itself, there's plenty of tactical gameplay involved in Ubisoft's shooter, but there's a lot in there that prevents it from being realistic. In this mode though, with no HUD, no enemy marking, more realistic magazine management, and an almost absolute focus on actual communication between teammates and hence a much greater level of tactics involved, Rainbow Six Siege gets a new layer of realism, which can make for some very thrilling and intense matches. Jurassic World Evolution. Again, I'm not suggesting that a game where you build a theme park where dinosaurs are brought back through dodgy science as the main attractions is realistic by any means. But as a management and simulation title, Jurassic World Evolution is pretty much compelled to have mechanics that do at least have some sense of realism. The prime example of this is the many times the game throws a storm at you. Electrical grids go dark, and you have to make sure you upgrade and protect them against that possibility. Fences can be broken, and you have to think more deeply about how to either prevent that from happening or how to minimize the fallout from such an occurrence. Park visitors obviously don't want to be caught in a storm, so you need to build storm shelters. It's an extra layer of complexity to keep in mind, and it ends up working very well with the rest of the game. Far Cry 2. To this day, there are many who feel like Far Cry 2 is perhaps the single most underappreciated game in the series, and in many ways even more accomplished than its successors. That's because Far Cry 2 was often grounded in gritty realism, at least as much as a game like this could be, and that made it a bit unforgiving at times. From managing your disease, to its at times unforgiving health mechanics, to its incredible physics, to weapon degradation, and so much more. There was plenty in Far Cry 2 that made it inaccessible to some, but for many, for exactly those same reasons, it was a tense, thrilling game that always kept you on your toes. Red Dead Redemption 2. What's that you say? We don't talk about Red Dead Redemption 2 enough? We've only mentioned it a few 100,000 times since its launch? Fine, okay. We'll just talk about it a little bit more. But seriously, how can we not talk about Red Dead Redemption 2 in a feature such as this one? What is for many the biggest draw of the game is for others its biggest flaw. Its unwavering commitment to completely grounding the player in the reality of its world. Limits to your weapon's loadout, having to maintain multiple meters, clothing according to the weather, weapon degradation, and a great deal more all come together to deliver an experience that is at times maybe even a bit too realistic. And of course, there's Arthur's torturously slow walking speed. That actually is a little unrealistic. The Hunter Call of the Wild. The Hunter Call of the Wild, like other games in the franchise, is built around being the most realistic simulation of wildlife hunting as it can be, and it often goes out of its way towards that goal. From animal behavior to the actual hunting and tracking mechanics to all the ancillary systems that are in place, Call of the Wild can be impressively realistic at times. Sure, some bugs here and there can pop up and break that illusion, but that's pretty much true for every game ever made. Farming Simulator. It's a game about farming, about having the right equipment, about having the right vehicles, about using them in the right way, about tilling the soil, about planting the seeds, about making sure that you take care of your crops and that they grow right, about protecting them from damage and harvesting them to reap your rewards. It's a game that shouldn't work because it's built around a decidedly mundane rhythm of realism, but somehow it does. Sure, like many other games on this list, it's not for everyone, but it can be strangely engaging and addictive. Football Manager. Often fondly, and sometimes unfondly referred to as Spreadsheet Simulator, Sports Interactive's Football Manager has long been a paradise for veteran fans of football. It places the focus on the management side of things, from managing players' morale and fitness, contract negotiations, press interactions, setting up training regimens, and so much more. It's paradise for those who like micromanaging, and while that's inherently making it less accessible than something like FIFA, as its legions of fans would tell you, there's nothing else like it. R-Factor. While the bigwigs like Forza Motorsport and Gran Turismo have made a name for themselves as the most prestigious racing simulation franchises out there, as far as pure realism and authentic simulation is concerned, there is very little in the genre that comes close to the R-Factor games. These sims have some of the most realistic damage and collision systems you will ever see, with excellent handling and a whole bevy of mechanics that add layer upon layer of authenticity. Sure, to achieve that sense of realism, R-Factor sacrifices a lot in the accessibility department, but for racing enthusiasts, it is paradise. ARMA 3. Rather than being an action-packed shooter like many other military shooters, not that there is no action here, ARMA 3 is a proper combat simulator, and one of the most realistic military shooters out there. From realistic aiming and shooting to managing your stamina, from the importance of stances to how weapons feel meaningfully different to each other in realistic ways. There is so much in ARMA 3 that demands active participation from the player, pulling you into the experience that much more. It may not have the sort of mainstream appeal that something like Call of Duty does, but for a large number of people, it is an infinitely better experience for it. War Thunder. War Thunder is often cited as being as realistic as a mainstream shooter can possibly get without being a full-fledged simulator. And while the degree to which that statement is true is up for debate, there is no arguing that there is some truth to that. Damage mechanics for vehicles feels less abstract than what you see in most games out there. Where your vehicle gets hit has as much of an impact as to what they're hit with, while piloting planes and tanks feels appropriately weighty. All of these being just a few and the most instantly obvious examples of realism in War Thunder. SHENMUE. When most games tell you that a quest is available at a later time, that usually either means that you have to skip ahead to that time or the game is going to do that for you. Not so in Shenmue. If you're out and about during the daytime and there's an activity that is only available at night, you have to run down the in-game clock and wait for nighttime. You do odd jobs to collect money, to do some other activities, or maybe just go to the arcade and play a few rounds of darts. For many, Shenmue's realistic passage of time proves to be a barrier for entry, but once you get into the rhythm, it serves to immerse you in its world immensely. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.